Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars and you're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned your subscription. What I'm going to be covering today is part 10 of my V-shaped guitar build. And specifically what I'll be doing is I'm going to be making the neck, and that's what I'll cover in this episode. I'm going to show you the whole process from start to finish. So without further ado, let's jump in and get started. The blanket that I'm going to be carving this neck out of is maple, and it's 4.5 inches wide, about 30 inches in length, and 1.65 inches thick. Now I'm going to be carving in both sides of this blank. So what I have to do to make sure that everything registers is I'm going to measure and mark the center lines along the length as well as across the width. And what I'll do is I will extend those lines down the sides. What I'll do then is I will use those lines to register the blank on my CNC machine, because as I said in my previous video where I made the fretboard, I have lines that are engraved in the wasteboard. One that is parallel to the x-axis and one that's parallel to the y-axis, and they're both in the very center of the wasteboard. So I can position the blank and then clamp it down so that those lines are lined up with those engraved lines on the wasteboard. And then after I've carved one side, I can flip it over, quickly register it once again for the other side, and proceed with carving it. Now, if you look closely at the wasteboard, you can see those lines that are engraved. And people have asked me all the time, why don't I just use a pin alignment system to quickly register the blank when I clamp it down? And the reason I don't is because in order for a pin alignment system to work, you have to be cutting the same size blanks over and over and over, which is definitely one of the advantages of using a CNC machine. But in the modern era, I can make guitars that are unique and different with every single build. And that means that my blanks are almost never the same size. So using the pin alignment system wouldn't work for me in that case. So I just use this simple approach. It may take a few seconds longer to get things registered and lined up, but it works perfectly. So I don't see any reason to create the fixtures and everything necessary for a pin alignment system. The CNC machines are really smart, but they don't know exactly where the spindle is until you tell it, and it does so through a process known as homing, where the machine moves the spindle to the front left corner of the wasteboard, where it trips limit switches that tell it exactly where the spindle is located. From there, I can numerically jog the machine to the center of my blank. Then I'll use a probe, which is going to tell the controller exactly where the tip of the bit is located above the surface of the work. And then once that's done, I can numerically jog the machine to the front left corner of my blank, and that's the home position, so that I can start the cutting operation. And in this case, I'm carving the slots for the carbon fiber inserts. Now the bit that I use for the carbon fiber inserts is an 1/8 inch diameter 2-flute spiral upcut bit. But for the next operation, which is going to be the front of the headstock face, I have to use a larger bit. I'll be using a 1/4 inch diameter 2-flute spiral upcut bit. Now whenever I swap out a bit, I have to reprobe it because the machine doesn't know where the tip is. So I don't have to go back to the center of the blank. Instead, I can just jog it to the right 1 inch and then back 1 inch, and then do the probing from there. Then I'll jog the spindle back to the home position and start the carving process for the front of that headstock face. So at this point, the top side of the blank has been carved. So I'm going to need to flip the blank, but before I can do that, I need to clean off all the wood chips that were generated during the carving process. Now you're probably wondering, why doesn't this guy use a dust shoe? Well, I do, but when I'm making videos, I leave the dust shoe off so that you can see what's actually happening. Otherwise, it's a pretty boring video. Registering the blank after it's been flipped is super easy. I just need to make sure that the lines that I extended down the sides of the blank are lined up with the engraved lines on the wasteboard. Takes a few seconds, but it seems to be accurate every single time, so that's the way I like to do it. And then after I have rehomed and probed the bit and all that good stuff, I'm ready to start carving the back side of this guitar neck, and that includes the heel and the contour as well as the back of the headstock. And there's really two operations that are involved here. One is a rough cutting operation that hogs out most of the material, and then the other operation is the finishing pass. And those two operations have been combined into one G-code file that takes about 45 minutes to cut. Now, after the backside carving operations are complete, the neck is essentially done, so I can remove the blank from the wasteboard and clean up all those wood chips. Now, whenever you carve a part out of a block of material, you have to leave tabs between the part and the material itself. That way, when the spindle cuts all the way through to the other side, that part suddenly doesn't become loose and free to be thrown about your CNC machine or your workshop by the spindle. So to cut those tabs once the part is complete, I just use my bandsaw and cut away the excess. Of course, there are remnants of the tabs still on the neck, so I can make quick work of those with my Japanese Iwasaka files, which removes them really quickly. It's been about 2 weeks since I carved this neck on my CNC machine. After I pulled it off the machine, I noticed as I looked down its length, there was a twist. I didn't panic, however, because I knew if I let the neck sit for a couple of weeks, there's a good chance that that twist was going to go away. And it did. Giving it a chance to rest, so to speak, allowed the wood to assume its natural shape. Whenever you carve a neck out of a big chunk of wood, removing all that wood is going to affect the stability of the neck, or actually more accurately, the straightness of the neck, because you're taking a lot of wood away that is supporting itself. So what you're left with, it's almost as if it was shocked into assuming a different shape. But once it's given a chance to rest for a couple of weeks, the wood returns to the shape that you desire. And if it doesn't return to that shape, there are some strategies that you can put in place as you proceed to force the neck into an ideal shape, which is to be perfectly straight and stable. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to install my carbon fiber reinforcement rods into the neck. Before I do that, however, I want to explain what I'm doing here, because if you've been watching my videos on this build, you'll know that I'm not going to be installing a truss rod into this neck. Now, I know the minute I tell you that, that's going to trigger some panic among some of you out there watching this, because you assume there has to be a truss rod in a guitar neck. And yes, it's desirable to have a truss rod, but it isn't always necessary. And with this particular neck, the problem I ran into is that this neck carve is too thin to allow for a truss rod. There is no truss rod on the market that will fit into a neck this thin. Because of that, I started to think about just using carbon fiber reinforcement as a way to keep the neck straight. The person that I'm building this guitar for never adjusts their truss rods, doesn't care about it. And I don't think that's going to be an issue with this guitar. So I've decided I'm just going to use carbon fiber as a way to keep the neck straight when it's under string tension. A lot of guys like to induce a little bit of up bow in their neck so that they have relief. And that way, when they play the guitar, the strings as they vibrate aren't going to buzz on the frets. Now, most of the vibration, the amplitude of vibration, or how much the string moves, increases as you move towards the bridge. At the nut and at the bridge, the strings aren't vibrating as much, but towards the center, which is in this area right here on the neck, that's where you're getting the most amplitude of vibration. And that can cause string buzz. Well, there are other ways that you can deal with that. And one way is to create what's known as fall off on the frets. That's an old trick that acoustic guitar builders use to reduce the potential for string buzz at the upper frets. Fall off is when you level the frets at a downward angle towards the bridge. So from about the 13th fret to the last fret, you're actually leveling it downward so that the last fret is a little bit shorter than the fret before it, and that fret's a little bit shorter than the fret before that. And it gradually increases until you get to the 13th fret. Then from the 13th fret on, they're all perfectly level. That allows you to reduce the amount of string buzz that's going to occur in that area. So I don't need to have relief on this neck. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to install these carbon fiber reinforcement rods. So let me bring you a little closer and I'll show you how that works. Originally, when I decided I was going to use the carbon fiber rods to reinforce the neck, my plan was to put a single thick slab of carbon fiber right in the center, and then the two smaller rods on either side. However, I ran into an issue trying to source the dimension that I needed. I wanted a 1/4 inch wide, 3/8 inch tall carbon fiber rod. I've used those before and they are extremely stiff. They do a fantastic job of resisting string tension. However, I was unable to source it at the time. Nobody had any in stock and I was kind of in a hurry to get this build going. So what I've decided to do instead is I'm going to sandwich two rods in the center. I'm not sure if it will be as effective as having that one bigger slab, but we'll see how it works. When I install these rods, I'm going to glue them in with epoxy. And this is where you can correct any issues with the neck, either bowing or twisting, while the glue is still wet. And it has to do with how you clamp it. What I like to do before I do anything is to check to make sure that the neck is straight. Now, in this case, I'm lucky because the neck is absolutely perfectly straight. There's no bow and there doesn't appear to be any twist. Now, the way I check for twist is I take my straight edge and I'll place that right over the corner up here, or this corner here, doesn't matter, either one. And then I'm going to hold that straight edge with my thumb and finger to form kind of a hinge. Then I will sweep it back and forth across that surface. And what I'm listening for here is I want to make sure that the straight edge is rubbing across the surface all the way. If there's any loss of contact, that is an indication of a twist. So when I glue the carbon fiber rods into the neck, as soon as I install them while the glue is still wet, I'll take, this is a larger level, I will place it again with this end over that corner, and I'll clamp it here. Then I'll clamp it at the center. Then I'll clamp it at this edge here. See, I've got the straight edge diagonally. And what that'll do is it will clamp out that twist. And then I'll just leave it that way until that epoxy has had a chance to dry. Then I can remove the clamps and the neck should hold its position, especially with 4 carbon fiber rods. Now let's get started gluing those rods into the neck. The glue I'll be using is 15-minute epoxy, and I like to mix it up in these plastic packaging containers. Whenever I buy something at the store that's packaged with these, I always save these because they're great for mixing up epoxy in. They're disposable. So I will just squeeze out an appropriate amount of epoxy. There. Now, if this neck had been warped or twisted, what I would have done at this stage, while the glue is still wet, I would use a clamping caul like you see here. I made this on my CNC machine. It has a curved shape lined with neoprene. And I would set the neck into that caul just to kind of support it. Then I would cover the neck with wax paper, and then I would use my straight edge. This is a level with a wide surface here, and I would place that on the neck. If it's bowed, I would just place it in the center. If it was twisted, I would place one end over one corner and then the other end over the opposite corner, and then I would clamp it using my this type of clamp, ratchet clamp, whatever you want to call it, and I would just clamp it firmly to remove that bow or twist. And I would leave it that way until the epoxy had a chance to dry. But since this neck is perfectly level, I'm not going to have to do that. I'll just leave it and let that glue cure, and then we'll come back to it to prepare the surface for gluing the fretboard on. Another thing that I can do is wipe the top surface with some 100% pure acetone. So I'll take a cloth and I will just dampen it with a little bit. You don't have to get it soaking wet because you don't want that acetone to get down into the slots, but then you can wipe that surface and it's just going to completely remove any of that excess epoxy that's squeezed out onto the surface. All right, it's been about 8 hours, and the epoxy that I used to glue in the carbon fiber reinforcement strips has dried and cured. And I've got to say, this neck is incredibly stiff. I don't think there's any way that string tension is going to cause this neck to bow. There's just no way. So what I'm ready to do now is to glue the fretboard on. To do that, I'm going to use the edge of my bench to support my clamps. And then I'm using this clamping caul, which I made on my CNC machine. I've got a bunch of these things, and it basically has a contour that matches the contour of the neck. And then I've lined it with some neoprene sheets that I hot glued to the caul. These neoprene sheets are available from most of your big box hobby stores. So I'll place that right here at the edge. And then I'll set the neck into that caul. Now this neck in particular isn't supported at the back here where the heel is. So what I've got are some shims that I can place underneath here to support the neck so that when I put it under clamping pressure, it's going to stay level. Nothing is going to bow. And okay, that should be good. Now the glue I'm using is just Titebond Original. Works really well for this. And I'm going to apply the glue. Don't need to use a whole lot, just enough to cover the surface. And then I'm using some table salt here. And I put just a few grains in a few spots. And what that does is it grips the fretboard and keeps it from sliding around. I'll take the fretboard, make sure that the surface is good and clean. And then I will set the fretboard down into position. All right, now to clamp it down, I like to use, it's a clamping caul that I made. And what this does is it concentrates the clamping pressure along the outer edges of the fretboard. That way, there hopefully won't be any noticeable glue seam. It'll just be wood to wood. So I need to position this caul right over, and then I can start clamping it down. The clamps can be removed at this point because the wood isn't going to move or separate. And now is the best time to remove the squeeze out that has occurred along both sides of the neck and fretboard. Now some guys like to wipe off the excess glue squeeze out with a damp rag while the glue's still wet, and I could certainly do that in this case. However, if you were going to stain the neck or use an oil finish, you wouldn't want to do that because the glue would end up getting packed down into the grain where it's almost impossible to remove, and it would affect the finish. Next, I'm going to drill holes to install the fret marker dots on the side of the neck. And I'm just going to eyeball the horizontal placement. I'm pretty good at that, but you could certainly use a ruler to get it precise. I do like to use my digital calipers to get a precise location for the vertical position so that it's perfectly centered on the fretboard. And once I've made a little bit of a divot there, I'll use a sharpened center punch to deepen the mark so that it's easier to drill. I used a 3/32 inch drill bit, which matches the diameter of the plastic marker dot rod material that I'll be gluing in here in a second. Then I'll apply a drop of accelerator into the hole, and I'll take the plastic rod material I'm using and dip it into some CA glue, which I've squirt out on the bottom of a plastic cup. And then I'll insert that rod into the hole, and within seconds it's fully dried and cured. And I'll take a pair of flush cut nippers and just snip off the excess. And once I have all the marker dots glued in, I can take some 220 grit sandpaper and sand them down flush with the fretboard. Then it's off to the belt sander where I can start to do the preliminary sanding on the guitar neck to get everything smooth. And I'm going to use every tool I have at my disposal, including my oscillating spindle sander. But of course, there's also going to be quite a bit of hand sanding involved. And I'm usually working with about 150 to 220 grit as I do this sanding. But ultimately, I want to finish off with 220 grit, which is a good grit to get the basic sanding work out of the way. Later on, I'll probably work up through 320, 400, 600 grit, however high I want to go. Then what I want to do is remove the subtle tool marks left in the fretboard radius by using my homemade 12-inch radius sanding beam and some 320 grit sandpaper to sand the surface. And you'll notice that I flip the blank around a couple of times as I'm working, and that's to cancel out any defects in my sanding stroke. But here you can see the dark areas where there's still some sanding work needed to be done in order to get that radius consistent from one end to the other. Once I've finished with that, I can then move on through 400, 600, and up to 800 grit, sanding by hand. Then the next thing I want to do is I want to drill the holes for the Floyd Rose nut. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the nut and the screw to figure out exactly how deep I need to make the holes. And I'll mark off that depth on the drill bit using some masking tape. Now the nice thing about the Gato nut that I purchased is that it comes with a special tool, and unfortunately you can't see it with my hand in a way, but it allows me to mark exactly the position where I need to drill those holes. And once I've kind of marked those out, I can then use my special sharpened center punch to deepen the marks so that I can drill them precisely. Since I'm going to be gluing the frets in with CA glue, it's always a good idea to apply some paste furniture wax on the surface of the neck. That way, if there's any glue squeeze out as I'm pressing in those frets, it's just going to sit on top of the wax and can be easily removed later on. Now, I am going to be using a precision applicator to put the glue into the slots. So as long as I'm careful, I shouldn't have any issues with squeeze out. Now the fret wire I like to use is stainless steel, and I purchased it in bulk from Just Car, and it comes in a coil, and as it happens, the coil has the same radius as my fretboard, so I don't have to do any radiusing of the fret wire. And what I'll do is I will carefully measure out the length that I need for each fret, and I'll snip it with my Dunlop fret snippers. And I try to cut them a little bit longer than they need to be. And you can see up there in the corner I've got that block of wood with holes drilled in it, and that helps me to keep my fret wire organized. And when you cut the fret wire, you want to be really careful not to pull it too short just before you clip it off, or you end up with a fret that's not wide enough to cover the expanse. And since the slots are blind slots, which means they don't go all the way to the edge of the fretboard, I need to snip off a small portion of the tang on each end. And I'm using a Centum's fret tang nipper to do this. And as you can see, it clips off that little bit of the tang, and it does so fairly cleanly. To install the frets, first thing I have to do is apply some thin CA glue, and I'm using a special applicator tip on the glue bottle, and that allows me to put the exact amount of glue that I need only in the slot and nowhere else. Then I'll position the fret into the slot, and I'll press the fret in using my modified Harbor Freight fret press. Now, after the frets are installed, I'll use a little bit of acetone to remove any excess glue that might have squeezed out, and sometimes there's glue on the tops of the frets themselves. Then I'll grab my Dunlop nippers and I'll nip off any excess fret wire that's sticking out from the edge of the fretboard. Next, I want to put a 35-degree bevel on the edges of the frets, and I'm doing this with a homemade fret beveling tool, which is just a block of wood with a file that's at a 35-degree angle. Now, since it's easier to level the frets before installing the neck into the guitar body, I'm going to go ahead and mask off the fretboard and do what I would call a preliminary leveling, which means I'm going to take off the tops of the frets and get them all level with respect to one another. And then I'll do some basic recrowning at this stage. But later on, as I'm doing the final setup for the guitar after it's been fully assembled, I'm going to do a bit more fine tuning of the frets to make sure that they perform perfectly and don't cause any sort of string buzz. There are a lot of different ways that you can level frets. You know, you can use a leveling beam, you can use a radius sanding block. It really just depends, for me at least, on the situation, and that's driven usually by the radius. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark the tops of the frets with a red Sharpie just so I can track my progress as I'm doing the work. And since this fretboard has a 12-inch radius, I can use my homemade fret leveling beam, which has a 12-inch radius carved into it. And I'm using 320 grit sandpaper, and I'll sand back and forth just until I remove the last little bit of that red Sharpie. Then I'll know that I've got all my frets level. And I like to change my sanding stroke position as I'm doing this work. That will help to cancel out any potential flaws in my sanding stroke. Even though I'm going to do a little bit more fret leveling work later on when I do the final setup, I'm going to go ahead and put the crown on these frets, and I'm doing that with a 3-corner Nicholson file here. And you can see how I move that file, and I try to work it so that I am grinding off just enough of that red Sharpie to leave a really thin line right down the very center of the fret wire. And really, that's as far as I'll take the fret leveling at this point. Later on, when I do the setup, I'm going to do some more leveling, and I'll also do the final bit of polishing and dressing of the fret ends. So now I can remove the masking tape. All right, well, at this point, the guitar neck is essentially finished. There are still a few other details. I would say it's about 90% of the way complete. I still need to install the tuners, and I need to screw in that Floyd Rose nut. And then I'll have to do a little bit more fret work, the final fret work that'll be done during the setup process. But for now, the neck can be set aside and I can start working on the body. And that's what's going to happen in the next episode, part 11. So I hope that you've enjoyed this episode. If so, give it a thumbs up. And again, if you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope I've earned your subscription. And for those of you who would like to help out financially with this channel, you can always visit my eGuitar Plans website and purchase a plan for a guitar or the tools that we use to make guitars. Or you can purchase those same plans from my YouTube merch shelf, which is displayed below the description for this video. And you can also get some t-shirts there as well. Any little bit will help to support the channel and will keep me providing the content that we all enjoy so much. So until the next episode, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for episode 11.